Public schools are actually forcing premature separation between parents and children.
This isn't new that the academic elites are kind of telling the wrong story. And what that does is it makes the relationships less rewarding. The child naturally feels rejected.
A woman has to want to put her kids first, always, forever, until death. And that is unbelievably countercultural. That is unbelievably unpolitically correct. And yet, it is the truth. Five 5% of college-educated American women are choosing to defy today's cultural norms and have 5 or more children. My guest today is a social scientist, mother of 8 herself, and traveled around the country to interview these moms on not only how they're handling such a large family in this economy, but why this was an important choice for them and our nation. If you have always dreamed of a big family but are unsure how people afford it, have one yourself, or just find large families fascinating, this interview reviews my guest's research and connection of some of the most extraordinary countercultural women among us. As she says, if America has a future, these women are the reason. Cold chills. Watch this interview on the Real Alex Clark YouTube channel. Make sure you leave a 5-star review for us if you appreciate unique guests like today's, and look for a link to make a tax-deductible donation to support the show in the show notes. This podcast is possible because of generous donations from listeners like you. Her brand new book is called Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Please welcome author and social scientist Catherine Pakaluk on today's episode of Culture Apothecary. How did we become a 2-child world?
That is the question. And in fact, we're a 2-child world trending to a 1-child world. So it's even crazier than a...
Really?
Yes, yes.
1-child world.
We
Why?
are trending to a 1-child world. That is the question. That is what everybody's wondering. I think the quick answer is that family and women's career, they're on a collision course.
It could be seen as pretty radical to be telling women you need to be having more kids. The plummeting birth rate is starting to frighten people.
Yeah.
Why is that a concern?
It's a concern publicly because of the economic consequences of a plummeting birth rate. The reason policymakers are starting to ask the question is because we can't pay for all of the social programs we've been used to paying for if the population is shrinking and if the working population is shrinking. And so that's the situation that we're in now. So that may not be the most important reason to worry about it, but that is certainly the reason that all the policymakers are wondering about it today. We're used to thinking, perhaps because of a bunch of we'll just say population scares from the 20th century. We are used to thinking that just there's too many people.
Yeah, I'm
Right.
always hearing that we have too many people.
Yes, yes. And this is part of the climate alarmism that we're living through now. But this climate alarmism didn't start yesterday. So today we hear a lot about the impact of the human population on the planet. That's the kind of thing that you hear about, the carbon footprint and the way we're changing the man-made climate change. And that kind of thing. The earlier version of this was, I think, less focused on the quality of the planet. The thing that people were worried about in the 60s and the 70s, less worried about the quality of the climate and more concerned about how many people there are on the planet and can this planet support all of those people. So that earlier concern, there's just too many people, kind of morphed into, well, maybe there's not too many people, but the few of us that there are, we're ruining the planet, right? So this is all bound up together.
You're a social scientist who set out on this multi-year journey, and you were going to travel America, interview college-educated women on why they chose to have 5 or more children.
Yeah.
What were you looking to find out doing this study, and how did you conduct the study?
Suppose you looked around and you realized that the whole world was suffering from some kind of, let's say, sickness or some kind of failure to thrive. Let's just suppose, you found out that health in America wasn't doing so good. And you thought, well, is this just the future? Or is everywhere we look, there's no healthfulness? And then someone told you, over in that little corner of Arizona or that little mountaintop in the Rocky Mountains, there's somebody really healthy. And we've just interviewed them a lot of times. I basically thought, okay, look, this is a 2-child world trending to a 1-child world. Is that the whole story of birth rates in America? It turns out it's not. All over the place, hidden away, mostly not visible to people. There are these larger, more generous looking families, obviously more 3, 4, 5, 6 children. So the simple question was, could we learn anything from those people? Or are they just anomalies? They're idiosyncratic. They can't tell us anything. But I had a hunch that maybe in a sick world, talking to people who manage to be healthy might be something that we could learn from them, right? There's this really funny account on X. There's a guy that goes around Miami Beach and he interviews people over the age of 40 who are super fit. And he just asks them, what are you doing? Tell me your routine. What do you eat? What do you do? What's your workout like? And why is this funny? Because we know that most of us over the age of 40, we're not super fit. So the proposition is we can learn from people who are, going against the grain, who somehow managed to make it work when everybody else is lacking in fitness. And so with this birth rate question, as a social scientist, I thought, okay, 5% of American women are still having, let's say, the desired family size, the number of children that they want to have. They're not 2-child families trending to 1-child. So let's just talk to them and find out what's going on. Are they just anomalies? Was there something intentional here? What do they do? What do they think? What do they believe? And how have they managed to do this? Could we learn anything from that?
Why college-educated women specifically?
I'll say it now, and I always say it when I've interviewed, not because I think of college education as any kind of norm or standard for today. I think the college education bubble may be bursting in lots of ways. The reason I interviewed college-educated women is because when we look around the world, we look at the globe of this changing population dynamic, the thing that looks like the problem, it looks like women's education is the problem. The more education women pursue, the lower the birth rate is. And that seems like a kind of law, or it's like an iron rule. So if you can find college-educated women who seem to defy that trend, that's where you might get some traction. You might get some lessons. So that was the reason, because that's what looks like the real tension is. My hunch was that education isn't on its own going to be the thing that militates against having families, but it's probably values. It's probably the values that are either coming out of that education, or it's the timeline or something else. But kind of digging into that was the project.
Now, I'm just going to say that someone from the outside looking in who is like, so what? This lady wrote a book that's all about having big families. You're a staunch Catholic. Is this just some raw religious book against birth control? What would you say to that?
Turns out it's not a raw book against birth control. And in fact, I write about that specifically because in general, when I tell people, hey, all over this country, there are people with 5, 6, 7, 8 or more children, people can't believe it. Those are numbers that are really hard to believe. And of course, there's a reason I talk to people with families that large. But the first question I always get is, are these just people who don't believe in birth control?
Yes. And I think a lot of people make that connection because you're also very staunchly Catholic. And that's historically been a Catholic Church belief. But then I learned for the first time in your book that most Catholics have basically completely abandoned the anti-contraceptive conversation.
In fact, I think that was true from the beginning. I don't think there's ever been a time, at least based on my knowledge in this country, when Catholics writ large accepted that official position of the Catholic Church.
So this is just like a myth, like a cultural myth?
Yeah, I think it is. Now, listen, when Catholics came over here as immigrants in the 19th century and the early 20th century, they were associated with larger families, right? So, that's not totally a myth. They were. But that 100 years ago looks like it does today. Immigrants tend to come from places with lower education and who are sort of behind the demographic trends. And Catholic birth rates, when they came to this country, ultimately converged to the regular birth rates in this country, Protestant birth rates. So it was not a myth, but it was it was not as intentional as people imagined it to be. So what is going on? It's not a birth control story. So what I did is, I talked to people of all different religions. And one of the really interesting things to find out is that in this day and age anyway, the people that I talk to, these are really intentional families. These are families that are being built, in a sense, one child at a time. People who had 3, they thought they got to 3 and they thought, gee, should we have another one? Very open to having another one. Well, we could talk about what that looks like. There's prayer, there's discernment, there's thinking about what that 4th child might mean for the family. There's that whole process. Again, oftentimes a prayerful decision, a decision in view of all of the circumstances of the family. But everybody I talked to, and this stands to reason, felt that they had a way to pick the timing of their child. I mean, so for lack of a better word, to plan their families. Many women I talked to use sort of natural methods to plan their families. They use the timing of their cycle and those sorts of things that we know. We're much better at knowing how to do that today. And I think it's something girls should know about. So a lot of women talked about that. But certainly many of the women that I interviewed just used, sort of ordinary means to space their children.
How did you find these women for the study? I mean, are they all Amish? Are they all bored with nothing to do? That's why they're having all these kids. These are the stereotypes.
Yeah. So I went around the country and we picked cities based on, we wanted some geographic diversity. We wanted to find out, well, it would have been interesting. Suppose you found out the only people who have big families are living in Kansas or they're living in North Texas or something. We went all over the country, the West Coast, California, Seattle, Spokane.
And who's we?
Me and my research assistants. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
research assistant. This is the real
Sorry.
deal. This is like true investigative journalism,
exactly.
and it's fascinating.
You can't do this by yourself or on your own completely. And I always like to say we, because in a sense, I can't take full credit for this, and I mentioned my great research assistants in the book. But we if you hit a city like Houston and you say, all right, we'd like to interview people who fit this profile in Houston, you go, where are the families? And so you call a contact in Houston, you say, where are the families? And you go on Facebook and you find the moms groups. And what will often happen is like, well, there's a big church over there. There's a lot of families over there. You might find a community center, but in a lot of places it was churches. You go to these churches and you find people. What did we do? We just posted flyers. We said, if you have a lot of kids and you consider your family size, purposeful, intentional, we would love to talk to you. And so people could scan a QR code and they could go and, fill out some details. And so we then picked from 500 or so people who applied from all over the country. We picked about 60.
This is fascinating. Yeah. And so truly random. You had like a really random sample size.
Yeah.
They're not all religious.
No.
They're not all white.
I want to clarify, it's not truly random, but this is the best practice for selecting a small sample size when you have to interview that many people. A random sample would have involved like us canvassing the whole country and maybe selecting with some sort of funny method. But it is, I didn't pick, these are people we knew. So what happens is they apply. So 500 people apply, say, and okay, we don't want to only interview people who are in Presbyterian churches or only interview people who are Jewish. So we looked at that 500 and we tried to select out a kind of a meaningful diversity of religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. Yeah, so just what you said. So you are doing this by hand, but you're trying to do it in a way that resembles the American population as best you can.
Were all of them stay-at-home moms, or were some of them also mothers of big families working full-time?
It was a mixture. I think in my population, the women I interviewed, around 30% of them were working full-time in some capacity. I say there were some professors, there were some lawyers, some doctors, but it was 30%, so obviously not the whole sample. And then another big middle section, maybe another 30% was working part-time. Some of those were part-time jobs that they held from home. And then another, maybe 30% were full-time stay-at-home moms. But I also want to stress that in the interviews that came out, that did not that changed over the lifetime for a lot of the women. So some of them had worked full time and had switched to part time when they had more children. For some of them, it went the other way. So yeah, not at all one size fits all.
So I have talked extensively to Suzanne Venker, and we talk about how women are growing up. They're becoming, a lot of them, resentful that they were not given, they feel, good advice when it comes to pursuing career and family and education and planning for the likely scenario that they will eventually want to stay home. And they just feel like we aren't given the tools early enough to make informed choices as women when it comes to family planning. And so I thought it was really interesting that some of the women in the book talked to you about having this sense of betrayal, which is exactly what Suzanne Venker has discussed, and how they have this desire for children in a home, but they also have all of this time, all of these years, all of this money wrapped up in an education or some sort of vocational training.
Right. You use the word family planning and in exactly the way that I came to use it after my book, right? So in the wider community, family planning means how to stop having babies or how to not have babies when you're sexually active with family planning. But what I heard was a different kind of family planning, which is sort of you have in this culture, you have to be quite intentional about planning the conditions of your life so that you can have a family. And that's amazing. That's kind of wild. I think a lot of the reason we don't think about planning for family that way is because we've assumed for so long it will just happen.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, parts of the feminist movement, parts of our culture that are anti-natal or anti-family have focused in on, the real women's empowerment, the real women's fulfillment, and, in ways that from a young age you're being coached in school. I was just thinking about this. Look, high schools have college counselors, they have career counselors. Well, they don't have somebody standing around in every high school saying, now here's some things you could think about if you know that you want to make it possible to have a family by the time you're 30 or by the time you're 25. So we don't think about it. We think it will just happen. But it doesn't just happen, as we know, right? So this two-child world trending to a one-child world, we do know from some survey evidence that that's not what women in general want.
When you talk to some of these women who had an extensive educational background that then became mothers, especially the ones that did become full-time stay-at-home moms, did any of them have a feeling like they were missing out, like they were not living up to their full potential?
What I heard was more language of there are trade-offs in life, and anything worth doing involves doing a little less of something else and a little more of something else. So yeah, some of the women talked about, well, gee, I'd like to get back to my music career, but it's on the back burner for now, and that's coming. So what I heard was women who really had a lot of pursuits and a lot of interests. Some of them were currently pursuing them, working in different ways, but others of them said, yeah, it was a loss to put some of their personal pursuits on the back burner. But as one lady said, it doesn't mean it's on the back burner forever. You're just rotating things and it's going to come to the front later. And I think that's a really interesting message about, you can't do everything at the same time, right? But you do have to pick your priorities and decide which things you can live without. Like, what are the things you're going to regret not doing later? So like Suzanne Venker talks about the sense of betrayal. I think that's real. And a lot of women do kind of hit their mid-30s, maybe their early 40s, and see that it's not what they hoped for or expected. And they do feel betrayed because they don't remember choosing to be on a train where they never came up for air and never got to sort of ask, like, is this what I expected out of life? And I think we can assist the culture by helping people to ask that question much earlier on. Like, no one's telling you, you could take a year off after high school before you go to college, and you could, explore some of these different things and take time to think about it. But it's just, pass that test, go right into the next thing.
We just won an election. Come celebrate at the biggest party in the conservative movement, AmericaFest, hosted by Turning Point USA in Phoenix, Arizona, December 19th through 22nd. Tucker Carlson, Riley Gaines, Dr. Ben Carson, Callie Means, myself, Charlie Kirk, Lee Allen Baker, Allie Beth Stuckey, and many, many more speakers to be announced soon. It is a family-friendly event. Everyone can come. It is going to be the biggest political conference on the right with tens of thousands of people. There will be a giant exhibition hall where you can shop your favorite conservative brands, live podcasts with your favorite conservative creators, and more. Go to amfest.com and use code ALEXCLARK for 25% off general admission. That's amfest.com and use code ALEXCLARK for 25% off general admission. If you struggle with debilitating migraines, let's take a closer look at items with fragrance that you use on a daily basis. Any plug-ins, candles with toxic artificial fragrance, toxic perfume, body wash. What about makeup? One of my favorite bronzers actually had fragrance smell like vanilla and chocolate, not to mention cancer-causing talc. Double check your bronzer today. I switched to Adele Natural Cosmetics, a 100% transparent, holistic, toxin-free makeup company that's also made in the USA. Look at this bronzer. Look at this. Look at this. Snatched. snatched and contoured. Adele handcrafted cosmetics makes everything in small batches without the use of parabens, synthetic fragrances, or anything else on an ingredient list that's difficult to pronounce. Everything from foundation to mascara to cheek highlighter, and it's all beautifully packaged and toxin-free. Their loose bronzer is a game changer, and I know a lot of you still want to wear perfume. They also sell that too. Their new Clean Dignity perfume has organic cane alcohol, organic sweet orange essential oil, mandarin, sage essential oil, vetiver, vanilla, absolute, and jasmine. Get a free foundation color match consultation at AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com and code ALEX for 25% off. That's AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com and code ALEX for 25% off your order of completely toxin-free natural makeup. What are the biggest reasons that people today are scared of having a big family?
I think people are scared of having a family at all. So I think most people don't contemplate having a big family. And of course, I want to stress that my book isn't so much recommending that people have big families, although I think there's a lot of unintended benefits or benefits people haven't thought about. And it's not so much about having a big family, but about what can we learn from people who've taken this cold plunge, so to speak. Great. So that sounds like something I'd never want to do, but I've been told there's a lot of benefits to cold plunge. A lot of it for a lot of people, maybe most people, is being scared of the unknown because you spend most of your life as a young woman doing things that are really different from starting a family, right? So you're good in kindergarten, you're good in fifth grade, you're good at eighth grade, you're good at high school. I mean, all those things are good to be good at, but they're not at all the same as having a baby. When you're in a two-child world, most people didn't grow up knowing a baby. Think about that. So I think there's a very widespread lack of knowledge. Say you're 24, you like you like your job, you like your coworkers, you like what you're up to, and every day there's a choice to keep doing that. But the family thing is like a very scary, different thing. And you're not sure you'll be good at it. You're not sure you'll like it. You recognize you can't return it if you don't like it.
Some of the women in my audience might be listening to this, struggling with infertility, and they're like, I don't know if I can listen to this episode. What do you say to those women?
Yeah, first of all, I'm so sorry, right? That's one of maybe the greatest suffering I think that you can have is to want to have a child and not have a child. A lot of the women that I talked to had struggled with infertility at different points in their lives, and they do talk about that. So of course, I hope that this work wouldn't be a source of grief for anybody in particular. But I do want to appeal a little bit to the biblical Hannah. So the biblical Hannah, this book is named for the biblical Hannah, in part because she goes through both. She is infertile for most of her life. And we know that in the Bible, she prays desperately for a child, and then God hears her prayer, and Samuel, Samuel is sent to her as a gift. And so I really wanted to invoke that sense that that infertility is a huge cross. And I think we actually to acknowledge it for what it is requires that we as a culture recognize what a great gift children are. And in a world where we don't recognize what a great gift children are, the burden of infertility is invisible.
To me, there is a difference between someone who is struggling with infertility, obviously, desiring a child and it's just not happening, or it's not God's will, it's not God's timing for you yet, versus a woman who is purposefully putting off motherhood because she is unwilling to become the sort of selfless that motherhood would require. Do you feel like that is a growing concern in society?
Yes. So what do we know? We know that biological infertility is growing. We as best we understand, we are all a little bit less fertile than we used to be. And that's something that I think probably modern medicine doesn't devote enough energy to understanding. I suspect it's a byproduct of many things, including various toxic aspects of our lifestyle, the way we eat, the way we do or don't exercise. I mean, all kinds of things that are about our lifestyle. But we also know that a good amount of what's going on is the lion's share is just being unwilling to make that shift. I'm hesitant to apply the label of, selfishness. I'm going to go ahead and use the word selfishness. But narcissism. It would be difficult for me to talk about the interviews that I had without using that word. Why? Because the women that I talked to used it about themselves.
Really?
Yeah. So they talked about the way in which having children freed them from a kind of narcissism or self-centeredness that they were unaware they were trapped in.
Oh my gosh, that's probably a huge struggle for many women.
Speaking from my own experience, that first baby comes and all of a sudden you realize that you had spent your entire day up until that moment thinking about yourself.
Yeah, focusing on yourself always.
And not in a bad way. Look, I think it's right that we should focus on ourselves. There's a kind of proper self-love, right? We could talk about that. Proper self-love. And actually, many parts of our culture don't encourage a proper self-love, right? People use this word self-care today, and I think that's kind of overused in a bad way. However, it gets at something, right? There's a proper self-love. If you're not responsible for anyone but yourself, it's not a bad thing that you spend your time planning and when you're going to do all your things. But that first baby comes and you go, whoa, like, whoa. And I thought I would never take a shower again. Now, that was not true. But for a few weeks, I just thought, I'm just gone. Like, how can I thrive this way? But that's a huge shift, right? That shift from being able to think about yourself all day long to thinking about someone else. And then try it again. And then try it a third time. And by the time you get through that 2 or 3 times, you look back and you go, wow, number one, I was a weaker, worse person because I had only learned to look after myself.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, I wouldn't trade it. I love that I've learned to look after other people. And I don't want to go back to being that version of me. I love this version of me. And then maybe the final step, like the final frontier of this thing, is you start to realize you can turn that new skill that you have of looking after your children, but you can turn that outward on all kinds of other things.
I think we've got this
friends.
sense of hyper individualism in America that's just tearing us apart from the inside out.
Yes, absolutely. So the women I talked to were unflinching in referring to their own former selves as being individualistic, not necessarily through any fault of their own, because I think that's how we grow up. I mean, we grow up like we're just concerned with ourselves. But in a sense, then there's this remedy in front of us. Right?
So one of my favorite parenting books of all time, and I interviewed the author, was Jefferson Bethke's Take Back Your Family. I love that book. I don't know if you've ever read it, but in it, he talks about how he believes the promotion of the nuclear family, having mom, dad, on average 2 kids, separate them from all of your extended family, move somewhere else. This nuclear family, as opposed to the multi-generational family, was one of the most catastrophic cultural decisions that we have ever made as a country. How do you feel about that?
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I don't want to hesitate in the sense that I don't think it was a decision that we made as a country. It's the outcome of a lot of little decisions. And you look back, you go, how did we get here? And obviously it's a good thing that people are able to move to other states and get jobs to support themselves, right? So we don't want to hack away at that. But did we come to think of living near family as a liability instead of the blessing and the gift that it is? I think we did.
Yeah.
I think we did. And so we celebrate this thing, you hear this language of, I wouldn't want to be a burden to my children. You hear this from older people as they're retiring. They save up. They don't want to be a burden. And I think to myself, that is a toxic view.
Why?
Why? Because it's great to be a burden on other people. No, I don't mean that in a negative sense. But why is it toxic? Because I think that's the meaning of family. The meaning of family is that it's a network of kin. And our whole job is to look after and care for each other. So parents care for their children when they're young. And the natural course of things is that as we grow older, we care for our parents. Now, setting aside true cases of abuse or cases where that cannot happen, it certainly ought to be the norm that we think we take care of each other.
Do you think we need to go back to a time where children were providing an economic value to the household?
I don't know that we could do that on purpose. Yeah, I don't know we could do that on purpose. I think that people fundamentally do things because they need to do them or they want to do them. I mean, I think those are sort of the 2 driving reasons why people do anything, right? So for instance, people talk a lot about we don't do enough community anymore. What does community do for us? Does it fulfill any of our needs, right? So we can meet most of our needs for social interaction on our phones, or maybe, we don't relax with community anymore. I can relax with my television set or my whatever, my Netflix. Whereas there was a time when the only place to recreate was going to be at the bowling hall down the road. Thinking about family, there was a time when children had more economic value to the household. And so, it would have been a dumb economic decision to purposefully just be done after one child. Like, who's going to get the water from the well?
We're putting them to work.
Yeah, exactly. Who's going to peel all those potatoes? Like things like that. I think it would be unnatural to go back to that. I do think we should think harder about the way in which some of our social programs, Social Security, it's about as American as apple pie, I would say, Social Security program. But what it does do is it means that having a lot of children because somebody will take care of you when you get older, it's no longer something people need to do.
One of the moms that you talked to in the book said to you, actually, me having so many kids, putting the older siblings in charge of helping with the younger siblings, giving all of my kids tasks on helping run this household, I think has insulated them from anxiety and depression because kids need a purpose. They need to feel like they're contributing to the home, and that her kids and her family in general, she thinks are so much happier because they do that.
100%. So these are the sort of lost wisdom of, so I don't know that anybody ought to have extra children so that there are these like amazing dynamics that occur in the way we grow up our children. But like, if you did have a bunch of kids and then all of a sudden you saw, gosh, like this is a better way to raise kids because look at what happens. Well, that's something we ought to think about. It's like a lost wisdom. What I heard from moms like that was something that I heard across all these interviews with all these moms, and we think about the people who are telling us today about the anxious generation, work of Jonathan Haidt, work of Abigail Shrier. Like, how do these depressed, anxious kids that are all growing up? I'm sure the smartphones are a lot of the reason. But what if one of the reasons is that our teenagers don't have little siblings? They don't have anybody to take care of. And the other fun thing about little siblings, like if you have a 2-year-old brother and you're a 16-year-old guy coming home from high school and, you're pimply and you're like insecure and you maybe had a bad day at school and you come home and what that 2-year-old thinks, that you are a hero, like you are the greatest thing ever. And you come home and that kid. So yeah, there's a lot of things that came out of these interviews that I wasn't looking for and they just popped out at me.
The big question everyone wants to know, how are these big American families affording to live? Including you. You got 8 kids.
Yeah. Well, I think that the message that came across to me was it's not as expensive as it looks like. It's just a question of what you're going to give up. Now, I don't want to gloss over the obvious difficulties. There are certainly difficulties here and there. But generally speaking, what did people say? And I really wasn't after logistics. I was after like, why would you do this? But the kinds of things that came up a lot, like you can thrift your clothing for your family. You reuse so many things. Yeah, at some point you make a transition to a larger vehicle. But once you've made that transition, after your third kid to the fourth kid, now you're out of a small car. Well, then that bigger car fits a bunch more kids. So it's not an extra expense every time. So something like the extra costs they're not double or triple. The extra costs, the marginal costs go down with like larger numbers of children. So that was one of the big messages that came through, was actually that it's not as expensive as it looks like. Now, okay, are there some things that might not be possible? Yeah. One woman talked about how when she and her husband were thinking about, I don't remember if it was like 6 to 7 or it was something like in that range, they had their kids in private school and they realized if we have another kid, it's going to mean we're going to have to homeschool. Like we're not going to pay for private school anymore for 6 children. That's just an over the top question. So, but then they said, well, would we rather have another kid or would we rather keep using private school? And she says, well, we looked at each other like, that's easy. We're homeschoolers now. So, that's, again, this isn't prescriptive. Like this is what everybody has to do, but they're kind of, they're examples.
What was some of the most unique money saving tips that you discovered within these families?
One of the funniest ones that I heard, which is it is funny, but it was said by one of the wealthiest moms that I talked to. She said that they go on these little staycations. They live in a pretty ritzy suburb of a major city. And she said that like once a month, they'll get a hotel room at like a low end hotel nearby. That's like, $120. And they'll take the kids there for like, they'll check in as early as you can and check out as late as you can. And there's a pool and they'll take the kids and the kids just go in the pool all day, tire themselves out. They'll order pizza. The kids everybody will just sleep on the floor. And I thought that was like hilarious. So they just view this as like, this is what they do for fun. Once a month, they go to this thing. And I thought, that's so funny and it's so creative. I mean, who's ever thought of just renting a room at a hotel just so your kids could go in the pool?
Are there examples of God's providence financially and straight up miracles occurring amongst large families?
Well, certainly by their accounts, I heard a lot of those sorts of things. You asked about money. It would be important to mention that a lot of the women felt that at key points in their family's history, when they felt that money would be a concern, that they trusted that concern to God, and that God provided in different ways. We used to use the language of God's providence. Like that's a phrase that everybody would have used to have known was God's providence. And so obviously a lot of these families are families with serious and devout religious faith, and they felt that God would provide. One lady had a long series, like, oh, there was this kid, and then we didn't know if we'd get that job, and we got that job. And so you can't exactly put that together into a single rule, like this is how it's going to work out.
One woman you talked to named Esther, she told you straight up, the quote was, our finances just don't add up at all. And she said, it was as if God was materializing money or needs were being taken care of out of thin air for their family on a monthly basis. That is wild, almost unbelievable.
Certainly this country is a very generous country, right? We know that we top the charts in terms of giving. And, my social media feed is full of, gifts and goes and all these sorts of things. I grew up in a large family, and I remember it was kind of embarrassing. We didn't need it, but people used to drive by, like push clothing out of their cars. This is, like in the 1980s, like bags of clothes that they might have taken to the Salvation Army, and they would push them outside of. That sounds terrible. Like you'd think, how embarrassing would that be? We didn't need it. But point is, this is a generous country, and I think there are tremendous opportunities for people to help each other and to assist each other. And I heard a lot of those stories, people showing up to help with tuition, people showing up to help with this or with that. Danielle in the book, referring to something completely different, but I think it's appropriate here too. She said, when you're trying to do something kind of that's worldly and cool, you're going to medical school or you're going to go like climb Mount Everest, it's a big deal. She said people are very happy to like help and pitch in, right? Because they think it's such a great goal. She said, but a lot of times you feel that when you say you want to do something like have another kid, people just kind of like shrug their shoulders and like that's just you ask for it. But what I did find is that in most of the women I talked to lived in church communities or neighborhoods where it had become, normalized that people are doing this. They drop off clothing. They give you like their hand-me-downs. So yeah, wild miracles. Our finances don't make sense. I heard that a lot. Of course, I talked to people who were very well off and they were doing fine. But I did talk to people on food stamps at the lower end of the income spectrum. And, again, it's not a prescriptive. It's not like go out and do this and God will provide for you. That is not the message here. But the message is actually to paint a portrait of this is a lifestyle that's possible in this country and it's possible all over this country. But it requires a little bit of creativity and maybe seeing things differently and thinking about what you're willing to give up.
Focusing on what goes into your body is important, but so is cleaning up what goes on it. Women using body washes with endocrine disruptors have up to a 70% increase in endometriosis risk, according to PubMed. I only use Aleavia Organic Prebiotic Body Wash, which feeds the skin's delicate microbiome. If you struggle with sensitivity to synthetic fragrance and chemicals, you have eczema, psoriasis, or burns, this body wash is going to change everything. Basically daily now, I'm getting messages from you guys that struggle with psoriasis on your scalp saying that Aleavia body wash and shampoo, because it can be used as either, has helped totally clear it up, okay? It's phenomenal. Their new Woodsy men's body wash is a favorite of so many of your husbands too. The green tea honeysuckle is my all-time favorite. I also love the cranberry. They have lavender, but don't forget, I wouldn't use lavender anything on any baby boys. And everyone from a baby to grandma can use Aleavia. Just maybe do a different scent for the baby. It's so gentle, so clean. I even use their pet shampoo. They do have pet shampoo on my dog Mochi, and I bring his own shampoo to his grooming appointments. Don't forget to switch your hand soap either. Aleavia just came out with their brand new Christmas scent, and I basically died and went to heaven. It's this balsam winter scent. You will never be tempted to go to Chemical Hell, the one store in the mall again. Go to Aleavia.com and use code ALEX15 for 15% off. That's Aleavia.com with code ALEX15 for 15% off the best organic prebiotic body wash. My favorite life hack that I thought was genius when I was 21, which is also kind of disgusting, was using the back of my earring in a pinch to get something out of my teeth. I know. I'm relieved to inform you that I just keep non-toxic Zebra floss in my purse now at all times. Zebra is the cleanest toothpaste, floss, and deodorant brand that I've found that shares my exact values, has gorgeous packaging, and quality products that work. After the owner, Jen's kids, got super sick, she realized that the majority of so-called non-toxic products in the supermarket were anything but. No fluoride, no hydroxyapatite. Instead, she uses xylitol in her toothpaste. The leading so-called non-toxic floss uses recycled plastic, not Zebra. And it doesn't snap or break or get stuck in your teeth. It is the best quality non-toxic floss that I've used, and ingredients-wise, nothing compares. Zebra is a great stocking stuffer or white elephant gift idea if you're creating, what about this idea? What about this? A non-toxic swap gift box. You just give them all these little products, give them masa chips, give them a Zebra floss, all the things I talk about on this show. Go to yayzebra.com, use code ALEX for 10% off any order. That's yayzebra.com, use code ALEX for 10% off non-toxic floss, toothpaste, and deodorant. You write about two different ways of life that were highlighted by Hannah in the Bible. Fitting oneself into a narrative of childbearing versus fitting children into a narrative of the self. Tell us about these two different paths.
So a narrative of the self is like a story what is the story we think we're part of? And in the Bible and in maybe times past, we understood ourselves more clearly to be part of a story of our family history, our ancestry. Like, right, when Jesus finally comes, there's this story of the ancestry of Jesus, and I can't tell you all those names. Like it's pages and pages, right? You're like, and that it was this guy was the father of this guy, was the father of this guy, and I mean, most of us, we probably can't really name more than our grandparents. One of the things that seemed distinctive to me after talking to 55 women who have built these large families was that they had come to think of their own personal story as a story about giving rise to new life and new generations and seeing themselves as part of a chain. Then what happened was, well, if this is your story is I'm the mother of Joseph, and I'm the mother of Valerie, and I'm the mother of Gregory. Well, that's your story. That's kind of who you are. Well, but I also might be an economist. I also might be a lawyer. Okay, that's great. Well, how does that fit into being the mother of Joseph? So that's kind of this narrative of childbearing, and you fit the personal commitments, passions, interests, personality into that story. And it seems like a small shift, but it was the kind of thing that so you thought, okay, so if you can make the story of your generations your main story, well, then what you do is you look at all these other things, because these are things that might be in conflict, and you just modify them so they fit. And so it's never been easier in a sense for a woman today. It's never been easier to fit personal interests, talents, callings, vocations, missionary work. I mean, I don't mean to make any of that sound small. Those things are huge. They're really important. I mean, you meet people all the time. I really feel called to serve in this way. And this way is outside of my home but if your narrative is generations and childbearing, I'm the mother of Joseph, I'm the mother of Valerie. Well, then what you do naturally is you go, okay, so how can I pull this calling to serve in this way into this life of being the mother of Joseph? And a lot of times it looked like something that was kind of a cool mashup. Like, people would be bringing their children into that vocation to serve in another way. So it sounds like a slight difference in emphasis.
There was another passage in your book. This was crazy. So you wrote, Modern contraceptives unbundled sex and babies in the household decision set, making each an isolated, separate object that is subject to isolated, separate human desires. So we can speak of demand for children just as we speak of demand for housing, education, status, lifestyle, wealth. You wrote, children do not need to be planned around, they need to be planned for. When children can be chosen or not chosen independently from sexual activity, the standard for the right age to have a child begins to rise after your degree or that trip or that house or that promotion. Time is a rival good, and more time spent on other valuable things necessarily then squeezes out time for having children. In short, you wrote, the propensity to have children responds to incentives like all other human activity. Wow, that is convicting.
Mm.
What are you trying to say there?
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that having children has become an opt-in, and that's because of modern contraceptives. They're really good. They're really effective at what they do. In other words, like if you decided, well, I'd like to live a life without children, you could do that. In the old days, if you wanted to live a life without children, you would have also had to be a celibate person and never get married and never fall in love. No one thinks today that that would be a good way to live your life, to never fall in love, to never be married, to never build a household or a home with somebody. But it is an actual option to fall in love and build a home and a household and never have a child. So I actually think most people do want to have a child. But what's happened is because you get to choose those two things separately. You can fall in love and get married, but then you later choose when is the right time to have a child. Before modern contraceptives, you just got married. And you know what happened? Usually you had a kid. Because why? Because sex makes babies. That's what I'm trying to say, is that once you separate these two things out, we now need to think about, did you want that baby? Do you want that baby? So in fact, what we would say demand for children, that's the economist's like dumb word. We say demand, it doesn't really say, but our desire for children, do we want to have them? We used to need to have them. Why? Because we all do need to fall in love and to be in beautiful, wonderful partnerships. I think that's a fundamental human need. And if you look around, nobody's trying to do without that. And I think that what's happened is because you have to opt into the child piece, you get married, and then you do. You think, when's the right time to demand that child?
You're saying that there is a reason that people are getting married later and having kids later, that we're basically being bribed as a culture to put off having kids. So then my question would be, and I think a lot of people's question would be, would a change in public policy change it?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So not the kind that most people think about. I think most people think about a change in public policy that would involve, like you just used the word bribe, like the culture's bribing us to go in this direction. And I think people think about changes in public policy that would look more directly like a bribe.
More extensive maternity leave, fixing the gender wage gap, if you believe in that, tax incentives, things like that. But what did you discover?
All right, well, here's a hot take. All right, nature's bribe to have children is getting married and having sex. It's kind of a bribe, right? It's like, this is the thing you don't want to live without. And it's sort of like, you may or may not think you want that first child, or you may not think you're ready, but guess what? Here it comes, because you wanted to get married. And of course you should want to get married. It's great. So that was nature's bribe. So we undid that. So now you have to choose. And then the question would be, are any of these like longer maternity leaves or tax incentives, are those big enough bribes to get people over the hump of like, it's not the right time, or I want to finish my law degree, or I want to do this? It doesn't look like it. And why do I say that? Because countries have been experimenting with these kinds of policy bribes to have children for decades. So countries like Japan and Korea, Austria, Australia, parts of Western Europe have been way ahead of us on this. And they've all tried to orient their public policy in ways to kind of directly incentivize people to have children. None of it's worked successfully, right? If it had worked, we'd all be looking at that country. We'd be saying, oh, let's go be like them. None of these countries has a birth rate that's a sustainable birth rate. So basically it does not look like you can directly sort of bribe or incentivize people to have children. I did say yes and no. So what about the yes piece? Well, just really quickly, let's just say cultures that still prize the connection of sex and marriage.
Who would that be today?
Yeah, those would be like living religious communities that are fairly biblical, right? Jewish communities, all sorts of Protestant communities. Now, I won't say, it won't be everybody in all of those churches. We all know that there's people who go by the name of of whatever
Right.
and don't really practice. They don't really believe.
Nominal Christians,
Yeah.
nominal Jews.
Exactly. So, but you look around the country, you go, oh, it's not just a coincidence that the people who are really trying to uphold, let's say, a biblical standard of sexual morality, you save sex for marriage. Marriage is for the sake of children. What you're finding is that a lot of those people, maybe they're initially opting into having children because they just want to get married. And that's kind of the way things work. They prize the value of children. But then what happens, this is the thing that I was so surprised by in my interviews, it's having the child, maybe for reasons that are idealistic, that leads you to see that children are worth desiring.
You're saying there is a driving force that can overcome and incentivize people to have more kids despite the economy being trash, despite societal norms saying big families are weird or they're too difficult to manage. So what is incentivizing 5% of college-educated American women to have 5 or more kids? What will persuade the next generation to give up their lives for their families?
So people choose paths that are self-sacrificial for the sake of higher things, right? So traditionally, love of God, love of your spouse, love of your children, the kinds of things that would make you want to give up your life in general, right? Because if you give up a treasured career listen, most people don't have to give up their careers completely. It's just you're accepting a little bit less of a go-getter version. So I teach college and so I have a bit of a career, but is it the same one that I would have had if I had no children? No, of course not. We like to imagine without kids, we'd be superstars, but actually, I think a lot of us without kids would just be like kind of lazy. So that's a bit of a digression, but for sure, you need higher things to get you to give up your self-interest. And so I expect in the future that however this demographic change plays out, we will see that we'll say living religious communities are places where people will still have children.
Did all of the women you talked to for this study always want a big family, always want children, or were there some conversions?
Yeah, that's great. I used to call them the converters at the beginning. I don't think I called them that in the book because it's a weird, but yes, there were a lot of people who came around to wanting children. I think a minute ago I said idealistic. So what I heard a lot of was that people who maybe had religious conversions later in life, like Hannah, who I talked to, you meet first in the book. She's a great story. She went to a secular college. She's a secular Jewish. Just wanted to figure out the meaning of life. Like was doing transcendental meditation and grew dreadlocks and moved to Hawaii and sat on the beach.
Dreadlocks on the beach does not sound like who I would picture for this big family mother. I love it.
That's right. And then she eventually, somebody said, let's go to Israel. She went to Israel. Anyway, in Israel, met this very charismatic, I'll say living religious community, charismatic rabbi who had a number of children. And in that community, she also met her husband who also had dreadlocks and was searching for the meaning of life. And they just realized, this is it. Like having children and becoming intentionally Jewish is the path to the meaning of life. Now, notice that is not the same as I really want a kid the way people want a puppy. They know there's a lot of warm fuzzies and it's going to be great and rewarding. It was sort of a higher idealistic thing. This is how we want to organize our lives. But what happened to almost all the women I talked to is after committing to some idealistic vision of marriage and family, then children are you learn about them and you go, oh, actually it's pretty much much better than I expected. So that led often in this context of being open. You have a husband who's willing to consider having more than 1.6 children. You have a church that's going to bring you meals. They don't think you're strange. So in that context where it's possible, you have support from your husband and your family. Maybe your church is supporting you. You go, do I really want another one? And you go, well, heck yeah.
Yeah.
That was the best thing I ever did.
How is China looking right now after many years of implementing a one-child policy? They ended up reversing that decision, right? How come?
Yeah, they reversed it because they saw that it was catastrophic for them. China, we're now 2 years into the official statistics. Chinese population is actually shrinking, meaning there are less Chinese living people today in the country of China than there were last year. That's shrinking. Not that their growth rate is shrinking. The population is shrinking. And most people are blown away by that. China saw that their one-child policy was, economically catastrophic for them. They tried to reverse it. They have not been able to reverse. I mean, they've not been able to encourage people to do what they for so long told them not to do. And so China's looking bad. I mean, they're looking bad in the way that, many countries, I mean, South Korea right now, the typical woman, we expect her to have 0.6, 0.7 at the upper bound. So China's really bad. Korea's really, really bad.
Are people in China still, even though the policy is reversed and you can have, I'm assuming you can have as many kids as you want?
Yeah.
So even though that's reversed, are people still kind of sticking to having only one there?
Yeah. So first it was the one child, then it was like a 2-child policy phase. And now I think they're just trying to get people to change their minds and have kids at all. So I don't think they can get people to have 2 kids. So of course, what a lot of people say about China, we don't really know what's going on because we're not sure we can trust the official numbers.
True.
We're not really sure what the policies are. But yeah, I mean, it turns out that culture matters a lot. And so if you spend a lot of time, I mean, that's just a terrible episode. We blame China a lot, and we should. This is a terrible, reprehensible regime that has just really annihilated its families and annihilated its the will to live, I think, for a lot of people. But we often let the West off the hook on that. There were, demographers at elite universities in this country providing like the scientific basis for the things on which the one-child policy was built. So I just want to make sure I say that parts of our kind of, we'll say, academic elites in this country, this isn't new that the academic elites are kind of telling the wrong story.
Okay, well, this is perfect that you bring this up because what I was going to say, one thing that another juicy part of your book was one of the moms you interviewed, Kim. She said that she thinks American schooling tends to undermine families rather than support them. She said public schools are actually forcing premature separation between parents and children.
That blew my mind.
That was so well said.
I know. I couldn't believe it. I could tell you, I can imagine sitting in the back room of her church where she was telling me the story. And I thought, I've been largely very supportive of private schools and religious schooling. But in general, I haven't built up a whole theory about this. What did she say? She said that she feels that one of the things that's driving lower birth rates is that schooling in general, but especially the way we do public schooling, forces an unnatural separation between parents and children from their siblings. And what that does is it makes the relationships less rewarding.
Wow.
And I was blown away by this. I thought, wait a second, like, are you saying what I think you're saying?
This is your second book.
Yeah, this is the second book, 100%.
This has to be another book, another whole thing on the American school system and how it's destroying families.
Exactly. And her whole thought was like, the child naturally feels rejected. And this reminded me of, Susan Venker and a lot of the research we have about what it means to separate moms and children at a young age. And I thought, yeah, so what she's kind of saying is like, you drop off your 4-year-old at, whatever preschool, pre-K, and then that's it. And like initially that's very painful for the child, maybe even painful for mom, but we just kind of assume it's going to be normal. We get on with it. And then we're all scratching our heads saying, why is it so hard to be connected to my middle schooler? Why do I feel so disconnected from my 6th grader, my 7th grader? I can't get my 8th grader to tell me stuff like what's going on. And what Kim was saying was, well, I mean, no duh. This child's primary relationships have been shifted to the school relationships since a really young age.
Oh,
and you're
man.
like, oh, it just kills you, right?
What if you didn't have to go to the store? What if you could just open your freezer and all of this amazing American meat from small farmers and ranchers in the Midwest was just right there for you? That could be the case with Good Ranchers. This is where I get all of my meat. I get a couple things local. I love my Good Ranchers for my back stock. GoodRanchers.com. Use code Clark. Get American meat. It's more important now than ever with this MAHA movement full speed ahead to be supporting these ranchers that share our values for real food and small government. Heck yeah, people, let's freaking go. GoodRanchers.com, use code Clark. That's GoodRanchers.com, use code Clark. Good Ranchers, American meat delivered. Can we talk one-on-one for a sec? Are you drowning in student loan debt right now? Do you feel like there's no way out? Are you discovering that your entire family is affected by it? If you've got private student loan debt and are behind, you got to call my friends at YRefy. YRefy refinances private student loans that others won't touch and provides you with a custom loan payment based on your ability to pay. They can reduce your monthly payment and your total cost, and they don't care what your credit score is. YRefy is not a debt settlement company. You can tell your dad that. You'll receive a low fixed interest rate that you couldn't get anywhere else and a pathway to making all the stress and worry come to an end. Just give them a call at 888-502-2612. That's 888-502-2612, or go to yrefy.com. That's letter Y, REFY.com. If private student loan debt is wrecking your life, it doesn't have to. Call YRefy at 888-502-2612 or go to yrefy.com. May not be available in all states. Another woman who piqued my interest in the book was Miki, a Japanese American who didn't want to have kids. Then she started having children, and, you know, as you do, there's ebbs and flows in marriage, and she was, you know, really analyzing her marriage and things that cause stress. And she was like, is it all the kids that we've had that are causing the main source of stress from a marriage, or is it work? And she realized that it was work. She said that kids are what actually made her marriage better.
I heard this from so many people. And again, it wasn't something I was looking for. So there were things I tell you about in the book that were the things I asked them about. This wasn't something I was looking for, but so many people talked about it. They talked about the way in which children make your marriage better in ways that you didn't expect. What were the kinds of things people talked about? One is the language of your marriage becomes a kind of mission. Like you've got this. So whether you're feeling up or down, like you said, ebbs and flows, like, you know, you guys hate each other this week, or, you know, next week you're super in love again, because that's normal. But what sustains you in the down times? It's like, well, all right, we might not be talking to each other because I don't like what you said this and I said this, and we're having a little thing, but you have to leave your bedroom and go downstairs and make breakfast for these people that you both love. And, you know, you kind of, for the sake of the kids, you have to kind of keep going.
But then some people might be like, so what? Are you saying that in order to save a failing marriage, you need to, you know, have a baby? Because a lot of people advise against that. So what would you say?
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think children should be instrumentalized in that way, right? So, and so no, like marriage is on the rocks or something like that. No, like you got to work through your problems. The basic point here is not go out and have a baby to save a bad marriage. You know, I don't know if I'm advising against that or for it, but the basic point is that kids aren't going to ruin your marriage, right? And this is the thing that people think about. They sort of think like there's a thing that you do, like you fall in love and it's romantic and you go on a honeymoon and you have all this thing. There's like there's who you are as a couple. And then the kids come along and like that's the end of you as a couple. And it won't be romantic anymore. And there's going to be like a baby in your bed. Like, that's not very romantic. And so there's this basic question about that. And so what I heard from a lot of the women was this story about how actually, because you come together to solve all these problems, and then you grow when you solve the problems. This is another piece of it, right? Like, so your husband rises to the occasion. So now he's the guy that doesn't just take you out on dates sometimes, but he also like, he does the things that you couldn't do. Like, I'm not a morning person. Well, my husband is a morning person. So when he gets up early and makes pancakes for the kids, now you have a new reason to be in love with your husband.
Oh, I love that.
How cool is that? Right? How cool is that? So I think for this, on this point about marriage and children, it's about correcting these terrible myths out there. And you'll see them every couple months. The Atlantic or Vox is going to run a piece about how, like, you know, kids changed everything and not for the better.
It can't be all peaches and cream. Some of these mothers who have 5 or more kids, there has to be some downside. There has to be something inherently difficult that large families have to deal with that small families don't deal with. What did you find out?
Yeah, I think the kinds of things that comes up, I mean, it takes a toll on your body, right? It's definitely objectively harder for your body to have 8 than to have 2, right? So that comes up. But I think the thing that people talked about most was like kind of the chaos of the moment, right? Like you've got 3 kids under 3, and you know what? That's super hard. Logistics, you know, just who's getting everybody someplace. So I know in my family, I thought when the kids were little, like that was the hard time. But as you get to, you know, later in like high school years, they've got activities and stuff. You're like, oh my goodness, it's still just logistically very difficult. You just have all these schedules. You miss stuff. I mean, just on my way here yesterday, you know, there was a kind of somebody didn't get to the dentist at the right time. And so it's not just one, it's going to be a bunch of dentist appointments. And so, yeah, so that's hard.
Recently, I had this idea that maybe being an empty nester is a modern thing and that we were never supposed to be an empty nester. So I want to get your opinion on this because this just like occurred to me recently. Maybe we were supposed to have so many children at all these different age ranges that by the time the littlest one is leaving the house, you have these older kids who are starting to get married and then they're having kids. And so then your home is filled with grandkids, and that's the true cycle of life and how we're supposed to live. What do you think about that?
I think that's 100% right. I could say this, I'm a new grandma. So,
Congrats!
yeah, so exactly. As of like 3 months, I think my granddaughter
you're
is
like
3
the
months old.
hottest grandma I've ever seen.
That's great. I love it. It's really, I mean, I've been saying for now 5 years that it's such an unexpected delight to be in my 40s and have 20-something-year-old children. Why? Because they're these adults that are their own persons. They have their own interests and their own personalities, and they're just not an extension of me. They are these like infinitely interesting, mysterious, wonderful human beings, but I happen to know them really well. And weird, they lived in my tummy. It's so odd. You have to pinch yourself and you say, oh, you used to live inside my body. That's so wild. And it's such a great mystery. It's so cool. But to be in your 40s, I don't know why the 40s especially, but I feel still young.
Mm-hmm.
And here are these adults that it's a special thing. It's like I've got friends and I've got these friends' children who are grown. Anyway, so then last year, my first grown child got married and they had a baby right away.
And you still have your youngest is 8
My
at
youngest
home?
is 8. And so to your point, yeah, 100%. So that's how I hope the future. My husband said to me the other day, we have a generous sized house and we have his mother lives with us. So she lives in the basement apartment, and this is a wonderful gift to our children and to her. We love our life together. And my husband said to me, well, in the long run, are we going to downsize when we don't need the extra apartment and this sort of thing? I said, are you kidding me? I don't want to downsize. I want to have whole rooms that are just sort of waiting for like our grown children to come with our grandchildren. And I think this is, again, one of these sort of lost pieces of wisdom.
Or maybe you and your husband eventually go to that little part and then one of your other children takes over the whole house.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, this is part of this burden thing. Like, it's not a burden to live with other people. It's just a huge blessing.
Wow.
But it's difficult. But the rewards are amazing.
What age on average did the women of large families start having children and then end having children?
Yeah. Well, as you might imagine, the women that I talked to who had like the bigger families, the 10s, the 9s and the 10s and the 11s, they had gotten married pretty young, like right after college or, right at even one like Terry had gotten married right before she finished college, had her first baby right around graduation time. And it's a great story. So some of them got married right at the end of college. And then others of them got married much later, like into their early 30s and still fit in 5 kids.
Oh, that's good. I'm not married and I don't have kids and I desperately desire that. It just hasn't happened. It hasn't happened on God's timing.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people ask, why do you cover these topics? How are you able to do these episodes? Because I'm, discussing openly and celebrating and promoting something that I don't have that I desperately want. But I think it's so beautiful and so important. And for those who it is part of God's plan for their life in this season, I'm so happy to be able to be the vessel to bring this information to people. And I feel like in this season, that is what I'm meant to do. You said that you think elaborate maternity leave policies actually suppress the desirability of motherhood. How and what? That is so anti everything that we've been told.
That's a bit spicy, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the hot take. Yeah, I think I'm becoming known as the sort of person who thinks family is great, but I'm also against all these pro-family things.
Why? How is that so?
And I'm not against pro-family things, but yeah, I think we need to engage these things on a realistic level. I think it's a little bit like the schooling point. I think the point that Kim made about schooling writ large is, it extends. Let me ask you this. Do you think it's easier to leave your baby off in childcare at 6 weeks? Like say we're an old-fashioned maternity leave is maybe 6 weeks. You take 6 weeks off. At 6 weeks, your kid goes into non-maternal care somewhere. Is it easier to do that or to drop your kid off after a year, say a longer maternity leave policy? Which one is harder? And now, everybody's different. I can't speak to everybody's case, but I will just say that for a lot of people, it would be a lot harder to leave your baby at 1. And I think the logic people think about 6 weeks as being harder because it's so fresh. Now, 6 weeks on your body is hard. You've just had a baby 6 weeks ago. Everything's changed. You're not even recovered yet. So I get that piece of it. We would like to push maternity leaves out longer. And I think if companies can do that and it makes sense for them and they want to use that to attract top female talent, that's all great. But will it make people want to have more children?
Kind of manipulative.
Yeah.
Companies
that's
promoting that.
That's the question. And I think we just have to say, look, I don't care whether it's 6 weeks or 1 year. It's a really difficult thing to do. It's a very unpleasant thing to do. It's the sort of thing that if you had to do it, and God bless anybody who does have to do it, lots of people do have to do it. If you can survive that, you're probably going to think, well, I got through it, but man, I don't know if I want to do that again.
So
right?
what you're saying is there is no company that can implement something. There is no policy that can implement something. A woman has to want to put her kids first, always, forever, until death. And that is unbelievably countercultural. That is unbelievably unpolitically correct. And yet it is the truth. And you're saying it.
Yeah, I think that is true. What it does mean, though, I think this is hopeful, right? So that sounded really extreme, right? What you just said. I think it's true. And I think it's good. And I think actually it's the sort of thing that leads to a lot of happiness and a lot of flourishing. But I also think it's hopeful, right? Because the way you just put it, you might have been like, well, anybody listening is just going to say like, well, that's just too hard. But no, hang on, hold up. We can do hard things. We can do so many hard things. And actually, the path to doing hard things is to get clear about what's true.
There's freedom in the truth.
There's freedom in the truth. And so for all kind of, if we do this more maternity leave, we do this, we do bigger tax credits, those might all be good things to do for their own reasons, but they aren't going to cause people to want to put children first, right? Or to reorganize their lives in these ways. What's the good news in this? Number one, that it's something we can know about as true. Number two, that actually that what's needed is a change of heart. It's a lot easier to change hearts than it is to change whole policies or whole cultures, actually. So I think there's good news in that. It's a kind of gospel of good news.
So the way to encourage women and men to want to have a big family and follow through on that isn't some magical law or anything. It's testimony of how it has been the best thing to ever happen to you. If you are someone that has a big family, is talking about it a lot.
A lot. I think telling the stories of our children is the most freeing and the most evangelizing thing we can do. So to talk about it a lot. And we just think about the way knowledge changes so many other things. I think like we didn't know a lot about the way animals were treated in the production of our food supply in the past, or it was kind of hidden to us. And the more we learn about it, the more men and women all over the country say, I don't want to eat meat that was produced in that way. I didn't know about it. And now that I know about it, I'd be happy to pay a little bit more, right? But it's not a policy. It's getting that information out, talking more about it.
So true when you put it that way. I mean, that's happened to me.
Yeah.
That's happened to my audience in the last year and a half.
Yeah. And I would say it's happened to me in my own life in the last, couple of decades. Little by little, you learn about something, you go, your head explodes. You think they're doing this? Like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. I can never do that again. But the reason that's good news is because actually, like little by little, people sharing the stories of their children, sharing the stories of what does it mean to get married when you're 22? Is it like weird or does it work? Is it great or is it bad? Will your life be over or will it actually be this thing where you build this marriage that's amazing? So it sounds like a small thing, but I think it's like a big, big thing. And I think it's the kind of thing that drip by drip, we can hit a cultural tipping point, right? Just like we've seen with a lot of other types of things, like who smokes anymore?
So true.
Right?
Yeah.
Little by little. And then all of a sudden it'll be flipped around and we'll think like, oh, everybody gets that. This is good for us.
So Catherine, what is your remedy for healing a sick culture?
I think we should try children. One of the things that was most maybe humbling that I heard on the road listening to so many women is so many of them talked about ways in which, about 20% of the women I talked to talked about either they themselves or someone else in their family being unexpectedly actually cured or healed from some kind of really difficult time, ranging from a mental health problem, a depression, a difficult moment, spiritually, physically even. And the first time I heard it on the road, I thought, okay, that's a cool story. Like this lady had a baby and she wasn't, she had a baby and her 11-year-old was depressed. And then her 11-year-old became not depressed because her 11-year-old was holding this baby all the time. It was like a nice story. And then I went to another part of the country and I heard a similar story again. And then I heard someone tell me how her husband got over his father's death by the baby that they had. And I heard this over and over to the point where I thought, oh my gosh, who's studying this? Is anybody looking at the way in which babies can heal a culture? Can they heal a family? Can they heal a broken heart? And I thought, we have spent so much time thinking about how we have to box children in to this little phase of our lives. Are you done yet? Are you done yet? You get this all the time. Oh, those are nice kids. Are you done? And I don't know why we get it all the time. But we box children in as if if we had that extra kid, it would probably kill us or it's probably harmful to our health. People have asked me this. Do you think that's good for you? What if the truth is something totally the opposite? What if the truth is that the thing that we need is exactly the thing we've boxed into this little corner? And we've said nope, there it is. I'm going to have my kids and be done. And then I'm going to go out and do these other things. But what if the truth is that actually we've been, let's say aborting and isolating and family planning away the exact thing that we need to get over depression, anxiety, feelings of loneliness. That's a really shocking possibility. But a country that has been, let's just say, living this lie about children for so long, it would be pretty awkward if that was the truth.
Naysayers are going to be like, so what? You're saying all women should be barefoot pregnant in the kitchen? And I'm going to go, yeah. Okay, remind us the name of your book again.
Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth.
Cool. And we'll put the link to Catherine's book in the description. What is the best place to follow you on social media?
On social media, I'm on Twitter, X, CR Pakaluk. Instagram's not built yet, but stay tuned. I have the Instagram and that's where you can find me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Catherine, for putting your heart and soul into addressing such a countercultural and largely ignored topic. It's so refreshing. This was such a refreshing interview. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hannah's Children was such a good nonfiction read, probably one of my favorite nonfiction reads of the year. I am somebody that knows I would love, God willing, to have a big family. So it was just fascinating to hear from these women who didn't necessarily have a conservative or Christian upbringing, which is, of course, the stereotype of people that choose to have large families, but they still saw so much value in raising multiple children. New episodes drop every Monday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. No episode on Thanksgiving, so we will be back the Monday after Thanksgiving with a really cool and unique episode with a beauty lawyer. She sues the beauty industry for toxins and chemicals that they put in their products. You are never going to think of some of the same brands at Sephora the same. I'm just telling you. Subscribe to Culture Apothecary wherever you get your podcasts, and of course, Real Alex Clark on YouTube. You can also watch on Spotify now. They have video. Get merch at tpusamerch.com. Use code AlexClark for 10% off. I'm Alex Clark, and this is Culture Apothecary.